All right. See, a lot of you guys got laptops. Glad to see that. The EndNote part will be in a little bit. I'm just going to give a quick recap, get everybody on the same page, sort of with probably most of you have seen this, probably even from me a time or two by now, but just the basics of what we care about in terms of water treatment, what types of contaminants are we really thinking about, how do we conceive of the regulation, where are they coming from, what do we have to be concerned about if it's rainwater versus groundwater versus surface water, that type of thing. So we're going to start thinking about that. So a brief half lecture on that, and then we'll get to some EndNote materials. As a reminder, we've got the topic selection due by Thursday, according to our rubric. So if you haven't yet, or if you've got any questions on that, please do sign up on the Google Doc, lock in a topic. And we'll go from there to set up sort of groups that make sense to present on later in the semester. And if needed, we can rearrange a bit. If everybody really liked one particular topic or something, we can adapt as needed. But okay, so that's the current scheme of things. Next week, of course, is Mardi Gras. So, all right then. I guess no lecture now. So no class a week from today. All right. Okay, so with regards to water treatment and thinking about where are we going to get our water for scenarios, well, really for anything, but especially as we think about what's available to us in a developing context. Really, one of the key motivations, obviously, is that we don't want to be sick from the water. We don't want it to be harming us. And so then we start thinking about, well, what are the ways in which water might harm us? And the first and most obvious one is the fecal-oral route of transmission. So if you've had the pleasure of watching me try to draw something, you might have seen me kind of sketch a little river, and we say, well, somewhere along the way, we have somebody using toilet facilities, and that's going to discharge at some point to the river, right? In some way or form, right? Surface water discharge of human waste. So hopefully we have some sort of a treatment there, right? Like when we talk about water and wastewater treatment, we want a barrier for wastewater treatment. Because inevitably, somebody downstream is probably going to want to take from this river water and use that as a source for drinking, right? And even if we do have a nice wastewater treatment system, we might have some sort of little fluffy animal. I'm not good with drawing fluffy animals, so I'm just, it's already pretty bad, okay. Worse than normal, but okay. And they also are probably going to excrete fecal matter. And now we've illustrated the fecal to oral route of transmission, so we want good protection on this front as well, right? So that would be our drinking water treatment. I should practice this to make it intentionally bad. Like, didn't you already? Okay, so that's kind of the scheme of things, right? So as we think about the fecal-oral route of transmission and what we can do about it, in the general sense, we have wastewater treatment plants, we have drinking water treatment plants, and we still have animals, okay? And we like the animals. But we just don't want to be consuming things that could make us sick. And the most likely thing to make us sick is some bacteria or a virus that does well in something else's warm-blooded gut, okay? We like our bacteria in the right place in our gut. If you think about our digestive system, it's actually very much like a plug flow reactor, all things told. Maybe the stomach itself is a bit of a CSTR, it sits there and mixes for a while. From there, it's actually all openings. So our inside our stomach is technically, theoretically, an open system with the environment. So it's things can pass straight through if they're small enough. We certainly, our biology has sphincters to seal off parts, but all told, it's an open system, and there are bacteria in certain parts, and we have a flow direction, right? And so if things are flowing the proper direction, we have the acid to protect, we have all of that operates in a way where we kind of want it to operate in this particular manner and keep the bacteria that are doing the dirty work in the dirty side of things, right? That's just kind of how it goes. So if we get things out of order, we end up experiencing problems. Or if some pathogen, some microbe has been able to infect something else, perhaps by getting out of order or just by disrupting the system, then that, we could be vulnerable to consuming that and having the same type of problem. So that, first and foremost, the fecal-oral route of transmission is a big deal. Now, this is not just water source, this is also directly to hygiene. So as we think about, do we have clean water to brush your teeth with, to wash your hands with? If your water you're using to wash your hands with is dirty, well, if you use soap, maybe not so big a deal, but still you might be rinsing a dish and now there's some bacteria there. And so when you eat off of it, cooking, drinking, obvious vectors, but also simply, do you even have water to wash your hands with, right? That's a big deal about having, as we'll see in Nicaragua, the modern bathroom idea allows for a lot better sanitation simply from the quantity of water. If it's not a burden to use a liter of water to wash your hands with, whereas at some point that might be a big burden because you'd have to go and extract that from a source, bring it to your place, and then you have that. That's very limiting. You're not going to wash your hands very often because you have more important things to do with that water. Tie into that education, not knowing that washing your hands could save you some disease, right? All of that comes together to say, okay, well, as we think about kind of the motivations here, certainly all of this is clearly important, and I'm going to add in hygiene here as a kind of side thought. Okay, that's not the only thing. Obviously, there are toxins. Let's say you have arsenic in your water. That's not so good to drink either. But the most obvious first scenario is this fecal-oral route of transmission. It turns out a lot of our modern diseases that we no longer deal with are solved in large part for having good controls here. So poliovirus, for example. Yes, vaccinations did a real wonder for that, but so did sanitation and hygiene, right? In fact, if we did not have proper sanitation and hygiene, it might be the case that polio would be breaking through vaccination sometimes, right? Because there would actually be significant exposure. So, having the protections in place on this side, because polio is a fecal-oral transmitted disease, right? So that's part of it. Typhoid. So if you're going to Nicaragua, I think the typhoid vaccine is suggested. There's actually a pill form. There's probably a shot as well, but I'm pretty sure there's a pill form. It's suggested because their controls over this are not as good, and it's a disease that's not so fun to get, right? So there's quite a few that follow the fecal-oral route of transmission. Okay, so then as we think about it, that being one of the fundamental ones, we can start to think, well, where is that a problem? So if we're getting ocean water and desalinating it, probably not a problem, because the desalination process, we've pretty much removed everything. If we can remove the salt, we've removed everything. So desalination is not super common, but nature kind of does it. So just simply evaporation and forming of clouds, get rainwater, that's a form of desalination, right? Thankfully a natural one. All that sunshine going to good use. So then we could use rainwater, so long as then the route that we collect it and then make use of it and store it is relatively sanitary. If you're collecting it off of a rooftop and you happen to have birds nesting on your rooftop or landing on your rooftop, well, there's some possibility of getting some pathogens there, right, from the bird droppings. Now, maybe a roof keeps itself decently clean with all the sunshine and heat, but there's still some probability there that there's enough organic matter and shields the bacteria, lets them survive till they make their way into your water, right? So some things to really give some good thought. Maybe you're storing it in a barrel and it's open to the environment, and squirrels like to drink from that, and who knows what else with that. There are lots of possibilities for what might happen, even for a good quality source like that. So as we're thinking about different parts, the water cycle, where we might grab our water, there's a lot to consider here. Clearly, surface waters are, have the fecal-oral route of transmission at play, so we got to be very careful with those. Perhaps if you're up on a glacier somewhere, that's not so bad. Kind of by definition, there's not a whole lot of warm-blooded animals living around, and if it's glacial melts, presumably you had it just straight from condensation and freezing precipitation, and then not a lot of bacteria going on up there, exposure from as soon as it evaporates and goes through that cycle. So if you ever have the fun of climbing a mountain that has a glacier on it, might actually be okay to drink some of the glacial melt. It's like summer. I did that one time, and here I am, right? I didn't get sick. With this water bottle even. Okay, so, but as soon as you're getting down to where there might be animals and other influences, it's probably safer to not drink it. Maybe spring, like water straight from a spring that's a nice natural source, and not getting like direct feed in from like a nearby lake or something. So certain mountainous streams might be a good source or a low risk source if you're just going to drink something straight from nature. But in general, we want to try to have some sort of treatment, right? Groundwater, and that's kind of ties straight into like the mountain stream idea. Groundwater is generally a good bet because it's going to have some natural filtration. Now, it depends a lot. If you're towards the surface, there's a lot of surface influences, and viruses and bacteria can be transported a certain distance into the soil, through the pores, all of that. That's going to happen. If you go deep enough, you're so far removed from human influences, assuming we're not injecting wastewater or something in the area. If you go far enough, that filtration, water can still transport, but on average, by the time water has transported 100 meters through soil material, there will still be bacteria and probably some viruses that feed on bacteria or whatever. But the ones that were human sourced and that were from some warm-blooded gut animal probably all have stuck to something by then. And now it's just natural soil bacteria and things that are still hanging out. Okay, so there's some benefit there. It's not, it's kind of a distance type of thing. So there are, as we'll see with some of the septic tank systems, usually there's some guidelines. Okay, you should place your nearest drinking water well at least this far away from your septic system, right? At least this depth, at least this distance, some combination there, right? So some radius. So that's the typical procedure. And that's assigning a number is actually kind of silly in the sense that it would vary, but there's a good number or a good practice type of number that we could use, right? That's generally safe or would be safe under most conditions. Okay, so that's kind of something to think about for groundwater. So groundwater is often going to be a simple source because it's usually available. It's usually some groundwater, perhaps in some really arid places it might be too deep to reasonably tap into. And then what you're left with at that point is perhaps some chemical contaminant concerns, right? Maybe it's salty, right? In Baton Rouge, we have a very nice aquifer, and there's kind of a natural barrier between it and south of here, we have other aquifers that are quite salty from the salt dome and things like that. And that's actually it's not ocean salt, it's from like historic salt dome, historic oceans, I guess. It's not saltwater intrusion from the ocean. But there is saltwater intrusion if we draw down too much of our water here, so there's ongoing battles lately about, people trying to get industry to say, hey, just take from the Mississippi and treat it. It's going to cost you a little more, but that's going to preserve our groundwater we'd like to drink, right? Like that's a current tension because they're concerned about that salt water coming through that. There's a couple spots in the barrier where it can come through, and it is because we're drawing down the water. Okay, so there could be a lot of things, and perhaps in that scenario, salt would be just too much or too expensive to treat. So it would be cheaper to treat for the Mississippi River water and get it into good condition than it would be to desalinate that salty groundwater, right? So a lot of this would be cost. And as we start thinking about, well, what can we do in a resource scarce setting, that cost consideration is even larger, but and more so by, okay, well, what kind of infrastructure would it take? Is there a way to do that to get it to be something reasonable? A lot of times you'll hear about, okay, well, if you've got some issue with your water, we think there might be some, a water main break or something, the boil water advisory, right? That's kind of okay to manage for a few days, in our lives. Like, it's not too disruptive. It's like, oh, that shouldn't happen, but okay, we'll boil our water. We should be safe enough, and we can do that because we have a nice stove. Maybe it's electric powered, maybe it's gas powered. We just turn it on, boil some water, maybe a little kettle, right? A boil water advisory for us is not so hard. But imagine if electricity itself or fuel to make a fire is kind of expensive, and then you have to do that, or otherwise you're guaranteed to be sick, right? Most people in that circumstance are probably, A, they might not know that they should boil the water, and B, may well not be able to afford to boil the water, right? I think we have sort of a definition. It used to be like $1 a day type of living was sort of the extreme poverty. And the numbers have certainly been improving. And modern dollar, I think it's like $2.50 maybe a day. And thankfully, the amount of people, the ratio of people in the world that are below that line has decreased, even though the overall population has increased. So that's a positive, but still there's a lot of people that would be in or around that category where, buying enough fuel to boil water, like that would be a substantial burden, right? So it's a lot to think about, and a lot to consider about how we can achieve good water or good enough water for people with very few opportunities resource-wise. Okay, so this is kind of just a further illustration of how we typically have things in an industrialized scenario where we may get our water from a stream, a river, or some sort of groundwater well, send it out for all the things to use. So this would be our barrier number 1 that we drew, and then our barrier number 2 would be the wastewater treatment. So just if we think about it at the whole scale, kind of that's what's happening, and the type of water treatment we have will depend on where we're getting it from. The type of wastewater treatment we take also kind of depends on where we're discharging it, in some sense. There are cases where we discharge to the ground. I mean, a septic system is an example. There are some limits to that, but in certain circumstances, maybe there's not actually a human harm result for discharging, or at least not so direct, and so that might dictate kind of how we think about what's going to happen. Of course, ideally we would treat it to the point where it's not going to be harming an ecosystem. Like that's what we want. But the first priority would be, are we harming people with a discharge, right? We'll try to alleviate that first, and then as we get more resources and more ability, we can prevent the environment. Actually, there's a great example. You'll probably get a chance to hear directly from Caroline at Amigos. They have situations sometimes where they have septic systems that they're using, but during the rainy season, they just don't drain. The water table gets too high, and or with clay, it fills up. And so what they've had to do is install valves to during the rainy season prevent their gray water from going into their septic system. So any shower water, any dishes, things like that, no longer going into the septic tank, and only toilet flushes go there. So the idea there is to allow the lower flow into the septic tank so that it can slowly handle that. And then you have surface runoff for the gray water. So that's kind of separating the definite human pathogens from the stuff that's dirty, probably will be a little disruptive for the local environment, probably a little stinky, might not be super pleasant, but the water has to go somewhere, and it wasn't, the current solution wasn't working. So that's the exact trade-off there. And as we were starting to try to figure that out last year, and now they're trying this in a few places, Caroline was even like, I don't like this. We're directly discharging to the environment. That's not good. We shouldn't be encouraging that kind of thing. But it's in a way probably a better solution than any other opportunity, right, or any other possibility. There was also some of the people I think wanted to do that so that they could have, they could use that gray water sort of as fertilizer for some plants, which is possibly good, engineered wetland type system, but also there's some potential hazards there as well if they're, some things to think about. Are there going to be like soaps, and is that going to impact what they're growing? Are they going to eat what they're growing? Is that a problem? there's a few more questions there, but overall that's a interesting case example of the potential issues there, right? Okay. So I mentioned typhoid already, and I didn't mean to click that link. Okay. Mentioned typhoid. Chlorine was certainly helpful for typhoid. Wastewater treatment as well. So during this period, we can see it really corresponds to the era where we were developing these barriers, right? It wasn't an immediate thing, but both barriers were coming into place around this time. Okay, so the way we in the States categorize from the Safe Drinking Water Act, the way we categorize pollutants are really toxins and pathogens for the main ones. And a lot of countries end up adopting US EPA standards and protocols. So a lot of times what you'll see is they've decided to try to achieve the same standards, or at least put them there as a reference mark to what they're going to do. So a lot of them will be pretty similar. So sorry. And we tend to take the primary standards that are impactful to human health, and then a set of secondary standards that are just kind of a little more voluntary. It's like, yeah, your water should probably not look brown, even if it's safe to drink. We make brown water all the time on purpose, right? I see some orange water back there. And that's intentional because it tastes good if it has tea in it, right? But that'll make it brown. So it's not the case that brown water is obviously bad. But especially in the context of like a municipal drinking water system, you're expecting it to look kind of clear. You're probably not going to be too happy when it looks brown, right? So there's some understandable aesthetics. And in the context of working with a community that's not used to having treated water, and then you add chlorine, the chlorine itself might be a very unpleasant aesthetic, right? We understand if the water tastes like chlorine, okay, just another day, right? Maybe if you leave it in a bottle long enough, it goes away and you just kind of don't notice, right? But if you've never had a chlorine before, and now you have all this stuff going on, all this fanciness, these people from a strange place telling you, oh, you should drink this water here. And you're like, ugh, it tastes like chemicals. Like, what did you do to my water? How's that going to feel? That's not necessarily a pleasant experience. And I think with things as essential as drinking water, it makes a lot of sense for people to be skeptical, right? That we can at least appreciate there's going to be skepticism about that. So that would fall into taste and odor. Chlorine would be an example there, even though one of the standards we hold is we say we have to chlorinate and have to have some residual, right? So one thing we'll have a chance to do is to take a look at, and one thing we might do actually is to take a look at a system that's chlorinating and look at the chlorine levels from the water storage through the distribution and see the chlorine decay across that distance. Something we looked at briefly on my last trip there. They had some questions like, is this too much? So we were able to go through and check and give some data and all that. Okay, so then typically we have some enforcement mechanisms for our primary standards, no real enforcement for secondary, just kind of best practices. And for these primary ones, the toxins we can kind of subcategorize into chemical and radionuclides, and then of course microbial for the pathogens. So speaking of aesthetics, often point out hardness is an interesting one, the amount of mineral deposits. If your water just has way too much mineral content, at some point it gets too salty, right? So there's some aspect of health there that could come into play. Could be simply too unpleasant to really be palatable. You've got sulfur, for example, can get to a point where it's like maybe okay health-wise, but just not so fun to drink, right? So there could be some problems where the aesthetics themselves get to be too big of an issue. And this is actually part of, I don't think we have such a good quality map for Nicaragua, but that might be kind of neat if we could. But some types of ion removal, there are a couple spots in Nicaragua where that would actually be really helpful. So I briefly looked into it last year, some ion exchange type stuff. So we'll talk about it, and that's one of the research topics. But if you have too much stuff, it's kind of healthy otherwise, but it just is a bit salty. It's a bit too much minerals, maybe too much sulfur, sulfate. Yeah, could be a clean but too much minerals, and an ion exchange system or some other way to remove ions might be a good option. But is that really practical for, like, the question kind of becomes, okay, we dug this well and we installed this system, and it cost a good amount of money to invest into that, but the water's not great. It's on the verge of, like, maybe you could use it, but maybe people wouldn't really use it, And what do we do then? We've have $20,000 invested into drilling the well and installing it, something like that. Might be a little more. Well, do we just move and drill another one and hope, or do we tack on a $10,000 ion exchange system? Maybe that's actually more worth it. So there's an interesting question there. I don't have a direct answer for, but I'm hoping that as a class we can kind of at least have some idea there, and give some thoughts for how they might be able to navigate that. Okay, so as we think about a typical treatment process, really what we're going to do in this class is dissect what would normally be a typical centralized system and say, well, how do we take that apart and just use what we need for a particular scenario? Maybe we're dealing with surface water. And with surface water, one thing you can do is some coagulation and let it settle. And you could do that in like a bucket type of thing. So sometimes we'll talk about some smart coagulation flocculation systems where you really just add a bit of stuff, stir it around, and then let it sit for a day, and then gently pour it into another bucket, and you have some sludge left over on the one. You could also add a bit of chlorine with that and do both at the same time. So there are, I think GM makes some powder packet kind of things that do both of those all at once. And that gives you a pretty decent resulting quality of water. There's some questions about whether or not you'd want to do that all the time, every time. You might end up with a lot of disinfection byproducts, depending on how much chlorine's in there and the water source. If you have a lot of organics, that tends towards making disinfection byproducts. So potential risks there, but at minimum, that's going to be better than diarrheal disease, right? So it might be a stepping stone, but that could be a thing. Perhaps just simply direct filtration. So we'll talk about things like a gravity-fed membrane system that perhaps you can just hoist a bucket of water, hang it on something, and then have a tube comes down, and a meter or two of water of the water height is enough pressure to push water through a membrane, and you can get tens of liters a day for that way. That requires a fair bit of work, but you can get membranes that way that don't require much maintenance. So that's quite possible. Perhaps you can grab some groundwater and all you need is a bit of disinfection just to guarantee that you're safe. Or maybe if it's good groundwater, you can just use it like that, right? So there's a lot to think about there, and we can consider the different unit processes we probably learned in 3110 or wherever, thought about before, and just take, okay, what's needed in this particular situation? What's the simplest, lowest energy, lowest infrastructure way we can accomplish that? So that's a kind of a way we'll be thinking about it. Okay, so how do we prioritize these? And we've kind of already mentioned this, but part of it's a triage, right? What's the worst offenders in terms of harm? And also what's the easiest thing to fix? So triage, kind of in the medical sense, is when you take a look at, let's say, an emergency room full of, I don't know, people that were involved in a war. And so now you're going to, they were injured. What you are trying to do is make sure that you can save as many lives as you can with the resources that you have, the amount of doctors, whatever. And so the point of triage is that you might not have enough resources to give everyone the full benefit this second, right? We don't have enough surgeons that every single patient gets a surgeon right now. So what you do is you look through and say, okay, well, you were injured, but you just broke the leg, that can wait an hour. Sucks, I'm sorry you're in pain, but you can wait an hour on that. I'm gonna patch up this guy who's about to bleed out, right? That'll be my first priority because A, that's pretty quick and easy, and then he's fine. And B, he can't wait an hour, right? He can't wait another minute, right? Or whatever. So there's the aspect of triage. So we can take the quickest and easiest things off the table first, and the most impactful ones. So diarrheal disease tends to be one of those high impact ones. We don't necessarily think about it that in the States. It's like we probably all have had diarrhea at some point and it's no fun, but we never thought of it as life-threatening or, typically. So you might not think of it that way, but in the context of chronic disease, especially for children, it can either be life-threatening or life-stunting, right? Or both, really. And so that's a very big one. So addressing the fecal-oral route of transmission, at least reducing the frequency with which that transmission is going to occur, is a pretty big deal. Along that note, one of the easiest things to get rid of would be larger organisms, what we might call parasites. This would, the parasite is a pretty loose term in water and hygiene kind of stuff. We sometimes refer to the microorganisms, Cryptosporidium, Giardia, and amoeba types, like those eukaryotic large things, protozoa, as parasites. But we're also talking like hookworm and things like that. So certain things that you could literally get rid of with a screen mesh, for example, that would have infected somebody, but you reduced the exposure or you physically removed it, and that was pretty easy to do. So that'd be a pretty simple one. Then you would kind of go down to bacteria. would be the next easier one. You still might have viruses if you filter with a particular size filter, but at least you don't have the bacterial diseases, right? So we could kind of triage down like that. So as we think about kind of the impact, fecal oral just sort of rises to the top that way. Now, other things are certainly important. Arsenic, for example, fluoride tends to actually become a big problem above 1.5 milligrams per liter. We think that it's pretty good for our teeth at low quantities, helps bond with our the enamel and create a very passivating layer. But in high quantities, it can cause some issues, some health issues otherwise. We can see some other quantities here. Nitrate above 50 milligrams per liter. This becomes a big problem, especially with babies. I mean, and that's quite a lot actually, so that's quite contaminated. But for infants, you'll have the blue baby syndrome where nitrate starts competing with what should be oxygen carrying from the blood. And so they end up oxygen deprived because there's so much nitrate that's competing with that. So E. coli, of course, these other, and coliforms, those are fecal oral type thing. Turbidity is often used as that just means how much particles are in the water. And so 0.1 NTU is just some metric we use to see how much light scattering. That's a generalized, like, hey, we should keep it not so cloudy, right? If we're drinking cloudy water, it's kind of obvious. Also tends to hide bacteria and viruses pretty well. So it's just good to have clarified water. Okay, arsenic is here with it's here twice. I guess there's some guideline in terms of like, I don't know why it's here twice. It's the same amount, just milligrams or micrograms. Ideally, you wouldn't have any. Just like lead, we don't want any. Sometimes there's a case where it's hard to measure below a certain level. And so, 1 part per billion is still too much, but it's below our detection limit, so we didn't know it was there. It doesn't cause a lot of harm, but we know that any amount of lead is not helpful or is counterproductive, is bad for your health. Okay, so then, of course, there are also other toxics. So if there are pesticide contaminations, for example, that would be a potential concern. A lot of that has to do with regional stuff. So we'd have to actually dig into what's around, what's going on, do we have specific concerns? And a lot of times the locals will know that, right? The locals will know, like, oh yeah, we're kind of worried this factory over here usually smells pretty bad, and sometimes the water tastes really bad. You'll have cases like that where you hadn't thought to think about it, and now you realize, oh, well, what are they making? Like, what are they doing? What might be, what should we look for here? What could be a problem? Okay, so last thing I'm gonna just go over real quick is the size of different contaminants. A lot of our removal processes will relate to the size of different contaminants in some manner. So whether it's filtration or sedimentation, the capability we have depends a lot on the size. So larger particles will settle faster. So if we are doing some sort of sedimentation, usually what we'll try to do is have some sort of coagulation, let them grow bigger, settle that way. Maybe we can get some of the bacteria even to stick into all that and remove some of that. Usually going to be some viruses and bacteria left over, but that would certainly be helpful for any subsequent treatment, if you have it, and for just getting rid of some of the bacteria would help. And it would probably get rid of a lot of the larger diseases. But otherwise, we also could think about filtration and even transport in groundwater kind of things. So it's generally a good idea to have a good conception of what kind of contaminant could be removed by a particular type of filter or media. So if our conventional sand filtration media is something like 10 to 100 micron particles up here, microfiltration with a membrane starts around one-ish, maybe 1 to 5 micrometer size pores down to 0.1. So if you ever hear like, oh, we used a 0.45 micron filter, that's talking about something that's like here-ish. So microfiltration may be close to ultrafiltration. If you're getting down to the point where you are kind of smaller, 0.01 micrometer, that's 10 nanometers at that point, you're down into ultrafiltration range. And at that point, you'll notice viruses tend to be between 10 and 100 nanometers, approximately. Some will be bigger. I don't think many are smaller than 10. And so with ultrafiltration, you'll be able to remove some or all viruses, depending on what type of filter you're using. You'll definitely be removing the bacteria. And if we take a look, bacteria tend to be around a micron or bigger. E. coli, I think, would be like, it's a little bit like a rod, and it's probably like half a micron diameter and maybe 2 microns in length, typically. So different bacteria will have different shapes and stuff, but they'll be somewhere around that area. Algae are going to be larger. The Cryptosporidium, Giardia stuff will be like here. So these are those microorganism parasites. And then you might, of course, have like larger parasites that are multicellular organisms that are, here and beyond. Right? So sand filter could get rid of those. Sand filter could get rid of most crypto too, potentially, right? Given the dynamics of how it's removing things. If we needed to remove some heavy metals, we actually have to go pretty far if we're doing filtration. And another thing that's plotted here is kind of the operating pressure you would need and the flux you would achieve given some membrane type. So if you're getting all the way down to like a reverse osmosis type membrane or nanofiltration to remove lead directly, you're getting to a point where you are using a whole lot of pressure and you're getting not so much water from it. So there's a trade-off in 2 directions with filtration. So the larger the pore size, the more water you get and the easier it is to get it. Okay, so filtration, we can do it, but it becomes very costly. So there's a bit of a sweet spot. And this the pressure, by the way, for every 10 kilopascals is about 1 meter of water, of hydraulic head, meaning like 1 meter above that spot. If you have a meter stacked up, that's 10 kilopascals of pressure. So that means you could do some ultrafiltration with 10 meters of water. So if you can elevate a drinking water source about 10 meters, 30 feet or so, you can actually have pretty good ultrafiltration just by gravity alone. If you get 2 meters, you can get pretty close to ultrafiltration, or maybe slow ultrafiltration, or at least some good microfiltration going. Right? So again, there's going to be a trade-off between pressure and flux, but you could actually, with a couple meters of water, you can get at least enough pressure to get water flowing across one of these membranes. 10 meters would be like a decent amount of water flowing across, so pretty good flow rate. All right, so those are all kind of thoughts about what we're going to face with the different contaminations, stuff you've probably seen, but as we dig in, deciding, well, what do we need to treat, what's going to be the problem, wanted to kind of give that overview. Any questions, issues with that? All right, so let's talk about EndNote. How many of you had the chance to download it? Almost everybody. Any of you have some other library citation software you wanted to use instead? It's fine if so. Okay, I'm for the assignment, I can't fully require it because I'm not going to get on your computer and check, but I'm requiring the level of professionalism that EndNote can do simply for you. So I'm suggesting to you that you would do yourself a big favor to get it or to get something equivalent and work with that. So if you haven't yet, you can go to the Tigerware website. I think a lot of you have done so. Search EndNote and download it there. You'll have to log in with your credentials and you can download it and install it. I think there's a web version as well. at least for the library sense. I'm not sure about for citations, but I recommend just getting it, downloading it. You'll never look back and be like, oh man, why is this stupid software on here? Rather, you might look back 2 years from now and be like, oh, I'm preparing this report for work. Why don't I just toss those citations in here and call it a day? And it'll just be like, yeah. Like, I look back and I'm like, how did I ever do any sort of research without knowing about EndNote? So I started using it, I think it's version 20 or 21 now. I think it was like 9 or 10 when I started using it. So it's been a little while. And it's not the most user-friendly thing in the world, but it's not terrible. So it can get a little annoying if you need to do something very quirky, like change the citation formatting so that instead of adding a comma in a particular spot, it doesn't add that comma. You could do that kind of thing. You just have to dig into the details in the software. Okay, so if you haven't, definitely suggest you check that out. Then when we go to actually cite stuff, and I'm going to stop the presentation in a minute and just go into like a live demo sort of situation. When we go to actually get materials for our EndNote library, I strongly recommend you go to the LSU library and go to Web of Science. Okay, so they just changed the format of the library system, so you could just go to, I think it's lib.lsu.edu, go to the databases, and then, if it's not already there, and then here, go to W, and then scroll down until you find Web of Science. Okay. There are other database systems. This is the one I use. I think maybe you could look for JSTOR, for example. For sciencey stuff, I tend to find Web of Science is super helpful. Obviously, you can find a lot of this stuff through Google or Google Scholar or Google, all of that, other search engines and things. But as you'll see, this is a way I like to search, and it has a lot of good conveniences built in. So we'll look at that more in a moment. This is what it'll look like when you do that. You'll have a page that looks a lot like this, and you can fill in what specifically you want to search for. And yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna, oh yeah, one more note before we launch into it. I recommend that you take a citation style and stick with it, and make sure that as you cite things in your work, it is presented in a professional manner. So I see a lot of citation mistakes that show up because maybe you included it one way, but then formatted it another or something. So when you set up your system, you can do author date. That's fine. Maybe it's Smith et al. 1994, right? That citation, and you'll see in EndNote, you could insert it. That goes before the punctuation mark. Okay. Now you can do the same thing and use numeric citations and have the bracket and a citation there. Also goes before the punctuation mark. There's an alternate. You could do a superscript numbers. Those go after the punctuation mark. Maybe there's some oddball formatting that doesn't do that just looks weird and awkward, but the ones I'm familiar with do that. Okay, so, and what I'm talking about here is like, of course there's APA, which probably looks like author date or something. MLA, all that. When I'm writing these, I'm typically thinking, oh, what does this particular research journal desire? What are their formatting requirements? And so that's kind of where I'm basing this off. I've seen all three of these in scientific journals. The default I tend towards when I'm, writing something, maybe it's a proposal or something, I'd like this one personally, but I'm happy with any of these so long as you're doing it appropriately with the punctuation mark. Okay, so if you're constantly doing this, but you have it backwards, I'm going to be annoyed. And that'll be reflected in in my feedback. So sometimes you might have to cite multiple things. And you could put it all at the end of a sentence. That's usually okay. But when possible, if you're making some particular claim, let's say I make the claim that some sentences make multiple claims in mid-sentence. If I have resources, citations to back up that particular claim, I ought to put those there, right after that clause. Especially if that's distinct from my other statement, my other claim, which is each case should be cited appropriately. So maybe here are examples of sentences or papers that describe mid-sentence citations, I don't know. And here is just the general MLA guidelines, or whatever, and how to not plagiarize. We could distinguish something more broadly or something like that. So as you cite your work, be thoughtful about using the literature that you find and the actual material stuff they present. So they learned something and you're citing what they learned, right? You're including that in your paper. This is how you do it, right? You make a claim based on what they found and you give them that citation, that credit. That tells me that this is not something that you discovered yourself. So you can talk to me about septic systems, and if you have an experiment in your backyard, I'd love to hear about it, and you should tell me about it in your paper. And then you can write about it with the authority that that's something you discovered. But if it's somebody else that reported on that, put their citation there so I know this is not you claiming to have done it, right? That's the deal with our research. Okay, so from here, I want to just give you some time to ask me questions, and I'm going to show you some examples of just simply using EndNote. All right, so I'm going to start with EndNote itself. Let's see, I already have EndNote up. All right, when we get EndNote and we start it up, it'll probably look something like this. And I'm also going to start a paper here. So I'm going to take an example, and we'll say we're working on a paper here. I'll do this. Working on a paper, and we also have an EndNote library. I'll probably just full screen one or the other in a moment, but we've got them here. We're writing a paper. We've got EndNote. If you don't have this screen separate, I know working with Maddie on this last semester, if you have a Mac, maybe it's hiding, like there's like the tabs up at the top. There might be EndNote up at the top left, and you have to actually select that specifically. And Maddie, I don't know what else did you need to do to pull it up?
Go on the top and hit file, and then it pulls up the MacBook library, and then you have to actually click the EndNote tab.
Okay. So if you're not seeing anything like this, try that. And feel free to stop me if you have some issue. Okay, so we have this nice little spot, and okay, what do we do with it? Well, there's a few things we can do. We can actually do an online search within EndNote itself, potentially. I generally try to avoid that. You can use it if you want to, but I prefer to go to the Web of Science, like I told you. So I'm going to bring up Web of Science. We'll walk through the process. So I've got the library, going here. Maybe we'll do just sort of a generic Google search as well. All right, so now I'm here And what I want to do is find an article and then send it over to EndNote. Okay, so let's imagine for a moment I'm working on my research paper here, and I decide that I want some discussion on estimating water tables using this thing called electrical resistivity tomography, okay, ERT. So that's one topic. I also want to make some claims about improved pit latrines and sanitation. So I'm going to find some papers on that. And the third thing is maybe some review articles about decentralized sanitation solutions. Okay, I'm just going to start with this electrical resistivity tomography and see what I can find about this. So maybe I'm thinking to myself, well, groundwater is going to be something in there. Maybe I'm also interested in groundwater quality, and then electrical resistivity tomography. Now, we can go a little more complicated here. We could search for an author, some date range. We don't have to just search for like kind of generic all fields, but let's just see what comes up. Okay, immediately we see 190 results. So there's 190 research papers out there that relate in some manner. Okay, that's not a whole lot, but that's plenty for what we probably need. Now, what we can do from here, well, certainly we can go and browse them, but maybe where we want to start is to say, well, perhaps I want to just know, rather than the ones that fit my search the best, which ones have been most important in the scientific literature? Like which ones have gotten the most attention, have made the biggest impact? We can actually sort, if we want, by how many times have been cited. So we could do the highest number of citations for any of them. This particular paper has been cited 145 times. So we can take a look, salinization process in the unconfined aquifer of somewhere in Morocco, a geostatistical, geochemical, and tomographic study. Okay, the next 100, we can go on and say, okay, these are the ones a lot of people are talking about. They made a big impact. Maybe they made a big discovery, right? They showed it really well. So that's actually a good quality filter. We could also start looking at, well, when was that published? If it's published a long time ago, you know, that's, so this one was 2009, got 145 citations. This one's 2016 and has 112. So this one's a little newer and is, you know, by the time it's also 25 years old, it might have more than 145. So we could get into the weeds of all that. We could say, I only really want the newest stuff. So we could sort it that way, sort it oldest, obviously. And maybe we decide, well, within all of this, so this one's, okay, yeah. This one's 2024. So maybe within all this, we want to specifically look for anything that involves a virus. Nothing related, right? There's actually no real reason they might be talking about viruses and this electrical resistance. Yeah, so that was not so useful, right? Maybe something, I doubt it, but something septic. Nope. But we could think of different keywords to subfilter. Maybe we just really want, let's say, I mean, that first one shows India. Maybe we're interested in all the ones that relate to India. Okay, so 33 of those mention India in some manner. Perhaps what we really want are review articles, something that searches the literature and collects all of these ERT-related papers, right, and describes the stuff. So there's actually a filter here to say, okay, give me just the review articles. That might be quite helpful so that you can see the papers that they cited. And so this particular paper, Geophysical Investigation of Seawater Intrusion in High-Quality Coastal Aquifers in India, they reviewed 297 articles. So another thing that this system allows us to do is see who they cited, right? Okay, now there's a lot of this is dealing with saltwater intrusion. Characterization and monitoring of porous media with electrical imaging, a review. Okay, maybe this one looks like something that will be really helpful for my research. I can make some general statements from this if I read it. I can go ahead and take a look at the abstract, and let's say I read that and decide, yeah, this is going to be helpful for my research. I'm going to send it to my library. I'll probably go read this. This is kind of my process a lot of times. I'll read the abstract and say, this looks useful. I'm going to come back to this. While I'm searching, I'm just going to set this aside, put it in my library, and then I can come back to it. If I'm smart about it and I notice something specific, I should take a moment and also write myself a note like such and such information from this paper. Like that would definitely help me as well. So what I do then, there's two things. One, I could actually try to access the paper itself. So I'll come back to that. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and deal with the EndNote side. Right? So to just even get that over into EndNote, we can go to the export button here, and EndNote Desktop is one of the options. Now, what you'll see is almost any journal that has scientific articles published and accessible or like on display will have some sort of citation export thing somewhere. All of the databases, all of the journals, they're going to have some convenient way for you to export that citation. Sometimes you just have to search for where that button is. Okay, so you can find this even if you're doing the Google approach. So it looks this way. In particular, on Web of Science, it's nice that you always know where that button is. It's bright, big export button, right? So I'm going to click that button, and it prompts me, okay, what do I want to do? I usually send the full record. I do not recommend doing full record and cited references. So, if this paper cites 3,000 papers, it's a massive review, that button would send all 3,000 over there with it. Right. I'm just interested in this particular paper. I'm doing the full record so I know that it's got the abstract and whatever else, right? I could probably just leave it as that, or like leave it as title, source, and abstract and be fine. So I'm just going to go ahead and click that. You see, it went ahead and downloaded this. It's probably in my downloads folder or whatever. And so maybe it pops into your EndNote program automatically. Maybe you have to tell it, like, please automatically open these. Once you open it, it knows that EndNote should be the one opening it, and it literally just pops right into your EndNote file. Okay? So give that a shot. Hopefully you'll be able to see how that worked. And I think I accidentally, it already had opened it into EndNote, but I went ahead and opened it a second time. So you can accidentally get duplicates like that. You delete a reference. So then inside EndNote, if you want to, you can categorize them by groups and things like that, do a little bit more organization. And then if you take a look at the entry itself, you can usually see some of the abstract summary. You can edit it, so you could make your own, right? So if you had some book that you wanted to add as a reference and you weren't able to find the book, sometimes the books don't have the thing. You can literally just add a new reference. Oops, this brought up a prompt here. I will show you. It's not letting me. Maybe. There we go. I'll do it the hard way. Okay, so we could literally take what we know about this particular book or whatever website and just make the citation ourselves. Okay, so if you find some citations, you can assemble that citation, tell it what it is, save it, and then that's in your library. Okay, I'm not going to save that one. All right, so now that we have the citation and we have a spot in our paper where we want to put that citation. So I made some discussion, I made some sort of claim about this ERT stuff, and now I have a citation that supports that specific claim. So how do I get it in here? Well, I place my cursor where I want it to appear, and this will be right after my punctuation mark there. I go over to EndNote and I select the citation, and this button that has a quotation says insert a citation. So Microsoft Word should have EndNote directly linked into it. And so you can do something in one and it sends it to the other. So when I click this, it'll pop it straight into Microsoft Word and fill out this text for me. Okay, so one thing you'll notice is once you install EndNote, you'll have this EndNote tab in Microsoft Word as well. So there's a few things to do in here, but to get the things into Microsoft Word, you go to EndNote, that library, and send from there. Okay, so there's our first citation. Okay, so let's take a look at pit latrines in sanitation. I'm going to go back to our search and add just a little bit of something here. So I'm going to clear this search. We're going to do pit latrines in sanitation. Now, maybe I also want to include sanitary as a word as part of my search. I can actually just put a little star here. And so anything after that T, it could be sanitary, it could be sanitation, it could be sanity. Whatever words that could follow that and match would be included in the search. So I'm going to go ahead and search that and see what. I'm going to add improved. And press the wrong button. Okay, so we've got 232 results. And you see this, I also did the same thing with improved, like improvement, improvised, whatever. So a spatial framework for improved sanitation to support coral reef conservation. Okay, that's kind of interesting, right? That sounds like a pretty relevant in terms of environmental impact of sanitation. So I don't know if that's going to deal with pit latrines or not. So maybe I'll take a quick look. And yeah, maybe I'll take this one as an example and say, well, I might want to do this one, but let me see if I can find the actual article and read it. Okay, and so there's a button here that says find full text from publisher. This is usually the first option to try. Some time ago, looking up the full text on Google Scholar seemed to work. That hasn't worked for me in a while. But you can go to Google and search for it. Sometimes you'll find it, but that link, for whatever reason, just doesn't seem to work for me. You could try it if you want. So a lot of times, clicking that button will take you directly to the publisher's website. That's what it should do. And depending on the journal, our library may or may not have a subscription to it. A lot of them it does, thankfully, but some of them not. This one looks like it does because we can click the View PDF button here. Of course, this is going to have an abstract and all of that. By the way, if you found this from Google or something, you could go back to Web of Science if you wanted to cite it that way or do the export, but Elsevier also has a little cite button. So we could click that and say export to RIS is compatible with EndNote. So there's a few citation styles. That happens to be one of them. So we could export this from this site if we wanted. And look at there, just go straight here. It's in our now imported. So if we go to all references, we see we have 2 references now. Okay. All right, so let's go back and see if we can take a look at this actual paper. So I'm going to download it or view it. So now I've got it. I could print it or download it and access it from here. EndNote technically might be able to find the PDFs for you, especially if you're on LSU's Wi-Fi. Okay, so let's pretend for a moment this is exactly what we're looking for. We're really happy with that. Well, I'll take a quick caveat. If we select a reference or two, and right-click it, we can say Find Full Text. And here, I'm not sure if it's going to work. We can find it through LSU. Maybe this will find it taking a moment to search. It's going to search its, so it found one URL for me. So I could manually attach a file and say, okay, I want it from this particular file, link it here. You don't need to do that. That's a little extra fancy. If you want to, go for it. That's just for your own convenience using the library system. So sometimes that'll work. Sometimes it'll automatically download it and attach it, and then that would it would actually show up in this data file, data folder. So I made a new EndNote library. You can do that in EndNote by simply going File, New, just make a new library somewhere. It'll just pull up a spot, new library. That's what I did before class labeled it 4156 example. And so now we have a 4156 example.data. This is just going to keep any of the references here. It's just a folder that contains the data back there. So you would notice if it found a PDF for it, it would put it there. You could open it through this. Maybe it'll find this one. We'll try this one. So you can manage it and view it inside this folder if you want to. Yeah, this one actually found it. So found PDF. So this one, didn't show it. Pulled up the PDF, found it and brought it in for us. And so I bet if we were to look back at at that folder, it's probably in there. Okay, so anyway, let's go back to this reference. We can then put this as our second citation here. Say we wanted that. There it is, right? Now, maybe we decide, I really think I'd rather structure my paper a little differently, and for whatever reason, I decide I want to talk about this first. I can move that, and look at there. The number is just updated for me, right? You want to be a little careful with Control-Z, because as it's managing the reference stuff, that doesn't always work out so well. I can try it here. I'm not sure. I think that'll undo it, but sometimes if you make a change to the reference itself, it might not undo that. So changing the, see there, it just tried that for a moment. Let me try it. If I do it twice in a row, yeah, did it. Now, if I were to just delete the reference, gets rid of it, I don't think I can undo that. Well, you notice it undid EndNote's automated deletion of this text, but it did not leave the citation there. So be a little careful as you manage that kind of thing, but it shouldn't be too much of a problem. Maybe it's just improved over the years. It looks like it did undo it. Okay, I stand corrected. Great. And that's actually very convenient that it can help with that. All right. Let's see, what else? How do you feel about this? Able to follow along at all? See how it goes. So this last topic, let's just take a quick look at what, let's go to Google and say decentralized sanitation solution. See if we can find some sort of scientific article. So not Wikipedia, not LinkedIn. Let's do case study. So here's something from Science Direct that looks journal-y. Yeah, so here we came, this is another Elsevier journal, so it looks pretty familiar. Since we're on LSU's stuff, we can probably just find it. I'm not familiar with that journal. That looks very specific. But you'll see we could have a citation there, right? So you don't have to go through the Web of Science process. I find it convenient, especially if I'm doing a lot of this all at once. But sometimes Google does a better job finding categorically what matches improved pit latrines, right? That might be a more convenient way to find the relevance match than Web of Science. So use both, either or, whatever you like. You can get the citations into EndNote one way or the other. All right, is that helpful? Okay, and this is will be online as usual. So if you need to refer back to it, or if you have any questions, let me know. But I think that's what I've got for you today. So let me know if you got issues with that. All right, so we'll see you on Thursday.